The German officer stared at the strange weapon lying in the mud of the trench they had just taken. He tried to understand what he was looking at. It looked like a normal rifle grenade, but someone had changed it in ways that broke every rule he had ever learned about weapons. The changes were rough and simple, almost homemade, but the 12 dead German soldiers lying around the trench proved one thing. Whatever this weapon was, it worked. When his report reached German headquarters 3 days later, the words he used stayed in the records. He called it barbaric, a weapon from a savage past, not something that belonged in a modern war. What he didn't know was that the Canadians who built it were not trying to make something clever or advanced. They were trying to make something that killed Germans, and they had succeeded better than anyone expected. The weapon was what Canadians later called a modified Northover projector. The name sounded official, but it did not explain what soldiers had really built. The original Northover projector was a simple British anti-tank weapon. It fired glass bottles filled with burning liquid at enemy tanks. Britain had rushed it into service in 1940 when they feared a German invasion and needed cheap weapons fast. It was nothing more than a metal tube on a stand. Black powder pushed the bottle out about 100 yards. By 1944, when Canadians were fighting in France and Belgium, the Northover was useless as an anti-tank weapon. German tanks were too well armored. Better weapons like bazookas and Piats had replaced it. Most armies would have thrown the Northover away. The Canadians didn't. Some soldiers saw that the weapon could be used for something else. If you ignored the name and the original purpose, the Northover was really just a short mortar. A tube that could throw heavy objects a good distance with fair accuracy. If it could throw bottles, it could throw other things. And if it could throw other things, it could throw explosives. The first tests began in Normandy in July 1944. A Canadian pioneer sergeant named Arthur Wilcox from Winnipeg found a Northover in an old British supply dump. Before the war, Wilcox had worked in mines. He handled explosives every day. He knew how charges worked. He knew how blasts behaved. He trusted his experience more than army manuals. When Wilcox looked at the Northover, he did not see a tank weapon. He saw a tool to launch bombs. The idea was simple. You had a tube that could throw objects. You had lots of explosives. The hard part was making something that would not explode inside the tube, but would explode when it hit the enemy. His first try used normal hand grenades. He put a grenade inside a tin can, packed cloth around it, taped it tight, and loaded it into the tube. The idea was that the can would protect the grenade during firing, and the grenade would explode when it landed. It almost killed him. The first shot exploded inside the barrel. The weapon was destroyed. Shrapnel flew everywhere. Wilcox and his helper survived only because they hid behind a stone wall. The second try used stronger cans and more padding. The grenade landed but did not explode. They had to crawl out and disarm it. The third try saw the can break apart in midair. The grenade flew wildly and exploded far from the target. The fourth shot worked perfectly. The fifth destroyed another projector. After a week of near deaths, Wilcox understood the problem. Hand grenades were made to be safe to carry. Their safety parts made them unreliable when fired this way. Sometimes they exploded too early. Sometimes they didn't explode at all. So Wilcox stopped using grenades. He built his own bombs. He took blocks of military explosive and shaped them into short cylinders. Each one held about half a kilo of explosive, as powerful as several grenades together. He wrapped them in cloth for padding. Then he added impact fuses, taken from anti-tank rifle grenades. These fuses were simple. When they hit something, a spring pushed a pin into a cap and set off the charge. Wilcox made them better by adding small lead weights. This made sure they exploded even if they hit at an angle. Then, he put the charge into a weak metal holder made from thin cans. The holder only needed to keep the charge together while loading. Once fired, the holder would rip apart, letting the bomb fly free. What came out of that trench was not pretty, but it was deadly. And soon, German soldiers would learn what it meant to face Canadians who had learned how to turn junk into terror. This eliminated the problem of carriers affecting the projectile's ballistics during flight. The first successful test firing happened on a makeshift range that Wilcox's unit had established in a field behind their positions. The explosive charge launched smoothly, the carrier disintegrated as designed, and the projectile flew in a high arc that carried it 93 meters before it struck the ground and detonated. The explosion created a crater 2 meters wide and half a meter deep, throwing dirt and debris in all directions. A sandbag dummy positioned at the impact point was shredded by the blast. Wilcox fired 3 more test rounds to verify consistency. All 3 launched successfully, all detonated on impact, and the impact points formed a pattern roughly 10 meters across at 90-meter range. The accuracy wasn't precision targeting, but it was good enough to hit a building-sized target reliably. which was all that mattered for the tactical applications Wilcox envisioned. He demonstrated his invention to his company commander, Captain Robert Henderson, a professional engineer from Montreal who'd commanded the Pioneer Company since the Normandy landings. Henderson watched the demonstration, examined the improvised rounds, and immediately grasped the tactical potential. The modified Northover could deliver explosive charges against fortified positions from outside effective small arms range, providing pioneers with a capability that filled a significant gap in their available weapons. Henderson authorized Wilcox to produce additional rounds and train other pioneers in the manufacturing technique. He also forwarded a report up the chain of command describing the modification and requesting official sanction for its use. The response from higher headquarters was bureaucratically cautious, neither approving nor forbidding the modification, essentially giving Henderson permission to continue as long as nothing went catastrophically wrong. Within 2 weeks, Wilcox had trained 6 other pioneers in the manufacturing process, and the company had produced roughly 40 modified Northover rounds. The production process was labor-intensive, but didn't require specialized skills or equipment. A pioneer with basic demolitions training could produce 3 or 4 rounds per day using materials from standard supply sources. The tactical application that made the modified Northover so valuable was urban warfare, which was exactly what Canadian forces were facing as they fought through the Norman towns and villages in July and August of 1944. The fighting in places like Caen, Falaise, and dozens of smaller towns followed predictable patterns. German forces would fortify buildings with machine gun nests, creating strong points that commanded key intersections or approaches. These fortified buildings could hold up entire companies, forcing Canadians to either conduct costly frontal assaults or call in artillery that would destroy the building and often surrounding structures. The modified Northover provided a third option that combined the range and explosive power of artillery with the precision and responsiveness of direct-fire weapons. A Northover crew could set up in a covered position 70 or 80 meters from a fortified building, well outside the effective range of most German small arms. They'd load their improvised explosive round, aim using the simple ladder sights mounted on the projector, and fire. The explosive charge would arc through the air and, if aimed correctly, would crash through a window or impact the wall near a firing port. The explosion of half a kilogram of Composition B inside a building was devastating. The blast would kill or severely wound anyone in the same room, often bringing down interior walls and ceilings. The concussion would stun soldiers in adjacent rooms, leaving them disoriented and unable to fight effectively for crucial minutes. And the explosion often started fires in wooden structures or buildings with flammable contents, forcing defenders to choose between burning or evacuating. German forces first encountered the modified Northover during the fighting around Caen in late July of 1944. Elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Jugend, had established defensive positions in a cluster of stone farm buildings on the southern outskirts of the city. These buildings were substantial construction, 2- and 3-story structures with thick walls and small windows, perfect for defense. The Germans had fortified them with machine gun positions covering all approaches, anti-tank guns positioned to engage any armor that tried to attack, and infantry in prepared positions throughout the complex. The Regina Rifle Regiment had been assigned to capture these buildings as part of a larger operation to clear the Caen suburbs. They'd tried twice to assault the position using conventional infantry tactics supported by tanks and artillery. Both assaults had been driven back with heavy casualties. The German positions were too strong, the fields of fire too effective, and the stone construction too solid for anything short of sustained artillery bombardment to crack. On the third attempt, the Reginas brought up a pioneer section from Henderson's company armed with a modified Northover and 12 explosive rounds. The pioneers established their firing position in a partially collapsed barn roughly 80 meters from the main German position. The range was at the upper limit of the Northover's effective accuracy, but it was necessary to stay outside the effective range of German machine guns. Sergeant Wilcox himself commanded the Northover crew for this first combat employment. He'd trained his men in the manufacturing process, but he wanted to personally verify the weapon worked under actual combat conditions before turning it over to other crews. His team consisted of 3 men, himself as gunner, a loader who would handle and load the rounds, and an observer who would watch for impacts and help adjust fire. The target for their first shot was the largest building in the complex, a 3-story stone farmhouse that German forces were using as their company headquarters. Intelligence from earlier reconnaissance had identified the building's function, and Canadian Commanders hoped that destroying or damaging the headquarters would disrupt German coordination enough to make an infantry assault feasible. Wilcox loaded the first round himself, carefully sliding the wrapped explosive charge down the Northover's barrel until it seated against the powder charge at the breech. He aimed using the ladder sight, estimating the range at 82 meters based on landmarks his observer had identified earlier. The powder charge was standard, but Wilcox had calculated that at this range, he needed to elevate the barrel to approximately 35 degrees to achieve the proper arc. He rechecked his aim, confirmed that his crew was in cover, and fired. The black powder charge detonated with a sharp crack and a cloud of white smoke. The explosive charge launched from the barrel, the tin carrier tearing apart immediately and falling away. The charge arced through the air, visible for just a moment as a dark shape against the gray sky, and disappeared through an upper-story window of the German headquarters building. The explosion was visible even from 80 meters away, a bright flash in the window followed by smoke and debris blowing out through the opening. The blast was audible as a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Wilcox's observer, watching through binoculars, reported seeing figures moving inside the building after the explosion, but it was impossible to determine casualties from this distance. Wilcox reloaded and fired a second round at the same building, adjusting his aim slightly to target a different window. This round impacted the stone wall beside the window rather than going through it, but the detonation still had significant effect. The observer reported that the explosion had blown out a large section of the wall, creating a breach roughly a meter across. The third round was aimed at a different building, a two-story structure that housed one of the German machine gun positions. This round sailed through a ground-floor window and detonated inside. The explosion was followed immediately by secondary detonations, probably German ammunition cooking off from the blast or resulting fires. The entire ground floor of the building erupted in flames within seconds. German defenders, already shaken by the unexpected explosions, found themselves facing spreading fires and structural damage to their defensive positions. The company commander, whose headquarters had been hit by the first round, was killed along with most of his staff. The machine gun position destroyed by the third round had been one of the key defensive positions, and its loss created a gap in German coverage. More importantly, the German defenders couldn't identify where the attacks were coming from. They'd seen the smoke from the Northover firing, but in the chaos of combat with other weapons being fired, they couldn't pinpoint the exact source. The high trajectory of the Northover rounds meant the projectiles seemed to appear from above rather than from a specific direction, adding to the confusion. Within 30 minutes of Wilcox's first shot, the German defensive position was collapsing. Soldiers were evacuating burning buildings, commanders were dead or wounded, and the coordination that had made the position so strong was falling apart. When the Regina Rifles launched their third assault, they encountered significantly reduced resistance and captured the buildings with far lighter casualties than the previous attempts. The success of this engagement led to immediate demand for more modified Northovers and more explosive rounds. Henderson's Pioneer Company found itself deluged with requests from infantry battalions that wanted Northover support for their operations. Within a week, the company was operating 4 Northovers simultaneously, supporting different infantry units across the divisional sector. The weapon spread rapidly through other Canadian Pioneer and Engineer units as word of its effectiveness circulated. Wilcox's original manufacturing technique was shared informally between units, with pioneers visiting each other's positions to learn the details of how to build effective rounds. Some units developed their own variations, experimenting with different explosive loads, different detonator configurations, and different carrier designs. One particularly significant variant emerged from operations in Belgium, where the fighting moved into larger urban areas with more substantial buildings. A corporal from Toronto named James Chen, who'd studied chemistry at the University of Toronto before enlisting, developed a version of the Northover round that combined high explosive with white phosphorus. Chen's innovation came from observing that high explosive rounds, while effective at killing and wounding defenders, often failed to force complete evacuation of strong positions. Defenders in basements or reinforced rooms could survive the blast from a single round and continue fighting once they recovered from the shock. Chen wanted something that would make positions completely untenable, forcing defenders to evacuate or die. White phosphorus was readily available from smoke grenades that were standard infantry equipment. The substance ignited spontaneously when exposed to air, burned at extremely high temperatures, and was nearly impossible to extinguish with conventional methods. Chen experimented with mixing white phosphorus with composition B explosive in carefully controlled ratios. The challenge was creating a mixture that would detonate reliably and disperse the phosphorus effectively. Too little explosive and the phosphorus wouldn't spread properly. Too much explosive and the phosphorus would be consumed in the initial blast without creating the persistent burning effect Chen wanted. Through trial and error, he developed a ratio of roughly 3 parts explosive to 1 part white phosphorus that produced the desired results. When these phosphorus-enhanced rounds detonated, they produced both explosive blast and burning phosphorus that scattered throughout the impact area. The phosphorus would stick to anything it touched, walls, floors, equipment, human beings, and burn with intense heat that couldn't be put out with water or conventional fire suppression methods. The only way to extinguish white phosphorus was to deny it oxygen, either by smothering it completely or by allowing it to burn through whatever it was stuck to. The first combat use of Chen's phosphorus rounds occurred during the fighting for Antwerp in September of 1944. German forces had fortified a row of waterfront warehouses, creating strongpoints that covered the approaches to the port facilities. These were substantial buildings with thick walls and multiple stories, difficult targets that would require either prolonged artillery bombardment or costly infantry assaults to capture. Chen's unit positioned 2 northovers to engage the warehouses from across a canal, giving them roughly 100 meters of range. They fired 6 phosphorus rounds in rapid succession, hitting 4 different warehouse buildings. The results exceeded even Chen's expectations. The phosphorus ignited immediately on detonation, starting fires throughout the impact areas. The fires spread rapidly through the warehouses, which contained various flammable materials from their commercial use. German defenders found themselves trapped in burning buildings, forced to choose between staying and burning to death or evacuating into Canadian fire. Most chose to evacuate, streaming out of the warehouses with their uniforms and equipment, often burning from phosphorus exposure. Canadian infantry, positioned to cover the warehouse exits, shot or captured the fleeing Germans with minimal friendly casualties. The Antwerp operation demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of phosphorus rounds, but it also revealed the weapon's problematic nature. Several German soldiers who were hit by burning phosphorus suffered horrific injuries that would haunt Canadian soldiers who witnessed them. The phosphorus burned through clothing, skin, and muscle, creating wounds that continued to burn even after the initial exposure. Medics treating German casualties found that the phosphorus would reignite when exposed to air during treatment, making medical care nightmarishly difficult. One Canadian medic, a corporal from Halifax named Michael LeBlanc, later described trying to treat a German soldier who'd been hit by white phosphorus from a northover round. The soldier had phosphorus embedded in wounds across his chest and arms. Every time LeBlanc tried to remove the phosphorus or clean the wounds, the material would reignite, causing the soldier to scream in agony. LeBlanc eventually resorted to keeping the wounds constantly wet while trying to dig out the phosphorus fragments, but many were too deep to remove safely. The soldier died roughly an hour later, likely as much from shock and pain as from the actual wounds. These kinds of injuries, multiplied across dozens of casualties from phosphorus rounds, created documentation that German medical officers sent up their chain of command. The reports described injuries that were difficult to treat, that caused extreme suffering, and that often resulted in death even when the initial wounds weren't immediately fatal. German medical staff used language that was unusual for military reports, describing the injuries as inhumane and the weapons that caused them as barbaric. The term barbaric appeared first in German medical documentation, then spread to tactical reports from units that had encountered northover attacks. German intelligence officers, trying to understand this new Canadian weapon, compiled reports from multiple sources and began constructing a picture of what the Canadians were doing. The reports described a crude improvised weapon that fired explosive projectiles, containing white phosphorus, creating both blast casualties and burning injuries. What particularly troubled German commanders was that the weapon seemed designed primarily to inflict suffering rather than to achieve clean military objectives. Conventional explosives killed quickly, and while the deaths weren't pleasant, they were at least consistent with how modern warfare was supposed to be conducted. White phosphorus created lingering, agonizing deaths that seemed excessive even by the brutal standards of World War II combat. A report from the commander of the 346th Infantry Division, which had faced northover attacks during the fighting in Belgium, described the weapon as barbaric in both conception and effect, and called for investigation into whether its use violated the Hague Conventions or other international agreements governing warfare. The report noted that while white phosphorus was used by all armies in smoke munitions, the Canadian employment in anti-personnel roles represented a different kind of use that might cross legal boundaries. These German complaints found their way to higher headquarters and eventually to the Wehrmacht legal staff, who examined whether the modified Northover represented a violation of international law that could be used for propaganda purposes or possibly even as grounds for reprisal. The legal analysis concluded that while the weapon was certainly brutal, it didn't technically violate any specific treaty provisions. White phosphorus wasn't a prohibited substance, improvised weapons weren't inherently illegal, and the Canadian use against military targets in combat zones was within the broad parameters of lawful warfare. However, the legal staff noted that the weapon could potentially be characterized as causing unnecessary suffering, which was prohibited under customary international law. The challenge was that unnecessary suffering was a vague standard that different nations interpreted differently. What one side considered unnecessary suffering, another might argue was simply effective use of available materials to achieve legitimate military objectives. The propaganda value of the barbaric weapon narrative was significant, and German psychological warfare units began producing leaflets and radio broadcasts describing Canadian war crimes involving phosphorus weapons. These propaganda efforts painted Canadians as savages who burned their enemies alive, contrasting Canadian brutality with German military professionalism. The propaganda included graphic descriptions of phosphorus injuries, sometimes accurate and sometimes exaggerated, designed to turn neutral opinion against Canadian forces. The effectiveness of this propaganda was limited because by late 1944, German credibility on questions of war crimes was essentially zero. German forces had committed so many documented atrocities across Europe that accusations from German sources were generally dismissed by Allied audiences. Canadian commanders were aware of the German propaganda but didn't consider it a significant concern. However, the propaganda did create some internal discussion within Canadian forces about the ethics of phosphorus rounds. Some Canadian officers, particularly those with legal training or strong religious backgrounds, questioned whether the suffering caused by white phosphorus was justified by the military effectiveness gained. These officers argued that high explosive rounds achieved most of the same tactical results without the horrific burning injuries that phosphorus created. The counter-argument, made by officers focused on operational effectiveness, was that phosphorus rounds saved Canadian lives by making enemy positions completely untenable and forcing quick surrenders. A position that might hold out through multiple high-explosive hits would evacuate immediately after a single phosphorus round. This reduced the overall amount of combat required to capture objectives, which meant fewer Canadian casualties. The debate never reached a formal resolution through official policy. Instead, employment of phosphorus rounds became a matter of unit-level discretion. Some commanders authorized liberal use of phosphorus, viewing it as simply another tool in the arsenal. Others restricted phosphorus to specific situations where high explosive rounds had proven insufficient. A few commanders banned phosphorus use entirely in their sectors, though these bans were difficult to enforce when subordinate units had the materials and knowledge to manufacture the rounds independently. Individual Canadian soldiers who crewed Northovers or who manufactured the rounds had varying moral perspectives on the phosphorus variant. Some viewed it as just another weapon, no different fundamentally from artillery or aerial bombing that also caused horrible injuries and deaths. Others were deeply troubled by the specific nature of phosphorus wounds and the screams of men burning from injuries they couldn't extinguish. A private from Saskatchewan named William Morrison, who'd served on a Northover crew during the Belgium fighting, kept a diary that survived the war and was later donated to military archives. Morrison's entries from September and October of 1944 describe his growing discomfort with phosphorus rounds. He wrote that firing high explosive rounds felt like normal combat. You shot at enemy positions and either hit or missed. But firing phosphorus rounds felt different because you could hear the results so clearly. Morrison described an engagement where his crew fired 3 phosphorus rounds at a German-held building. The first 2 rounds hit the upper floors, and Morrison could hear men screaming from inside the building as the phosphorus burned through the structure. The third round hit the ground floor and started a fire that quickly spread through the entire building. German soldiers evacuated through windows and doorways, many of them, with their uniforms burning. Morrison wrote that he and his crew shot at the fleeing Germans, killing several, but that he felt sick doing it because the men were already suffering horribly from burns. In a later entry, Morrison wrote that he'd requested transfer away from Northover duty and had been granted assignment to a regular pioneer section. He noted that he understood the Northover was effective and probably saved Canadian lives overall, but that he personally couldn't continue using it after seeing what phosphorus did to human beings. Morrison's diary entries were unusual in their moral reflection. Most Canadian soldiers who used Northovers didn't document their feelings about the weapon's effects. The tactical evolution of Northover employment continued through the fall of 1944 and into early 1945. Pioneer units developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for using the weapons, learning through experience what worked best in different situations. The basic shoot-and-scoot tactics that had emerged early remained standard, with crews firing a few rounds and then relocating to avoid counterfire. But additional refinements improved effectiveness and reduced risks to crews. One significant development was the use of forward observers who would position themselves where they could see targets clearly and direct Northover fire through radio or signal. The observers would identify targets, estimate ranges, and watch impacts to help crews adjust their fire. This allowed Northover crews to engage targets they couldn't see directly, dramatically increasing the weapon's tactical flexibility. Another innovation was the development of specialized rounds for different target types. The original high-explosive rounds remained standard for general use. Phosphorus rounds were employed against targets where forcing evacuation was the primary objective. Some units developed incendiary rounds using thermite or other persistent burning materials for setting fires in buildings. A few experimental rounds used shrapnel enhancement, embedding nails or metal fragments in the explosive to increase casualties against exposed personnel. The manufacturing process became more standardized as experience accumulated. Pioneers developed templates and jigs that made round production faster and more consistent. Quality control procedures emerged to test detonators and verify explosive loads. Safety protocols were established after several accidents involving premature detonations during manufacturing. By early 1945, an experienced pioneer could produce reliable Northover rounds with minimal supervision, and the weapons were integrated into standard Canadian Pioneer equipment. German countermeasures against Northovers evolved slowly, limited by the weapon's improvised nature and the difficulty of developing general solutions to a threat that varied from unit to unit. Some German commanders ordered their troops to avoid concentrating in buildings that were within Northover range of Canadian positions, but this meant giving up defensively valuable structures. Others attempted to locate and destroy Northover positions using artillery or mortar fire, but the Canadian shoot-and-scoot tactics made this difficult. The most effective German response was simply increased dispersion and reduced reliance on fortified buildings as strongpoints. By spreading forces across multiple smaller positions rather than concentrating in large defended buildings, Germans reduced the value of Northover attacks. A round that hit one dispersed position would cause casualties there, but wouldn't affect the overall defensive system. This dispersion had its own costs, reducing German defensive efficiency and making coordination more difficult, but it at least mitigated the worst effects of Northover attacks. As winter approached and the fighting moved into the Netherlands, Northover employment declined somewhat because the tactical situations that favored the weapon became less common. The flat, flooded terrain of the Netherlands had fewer substantial buildings to fortify, and combat increasingly involved fighting across open ground or through small villages rather than dense urban warfare. Northovers remained useful in specific situations, but they were no longer the constant presence they'd been during the urban fighting in France and Belgium. The final major employment of modified Northovers came during the Rhineland campaign in February and March of 1945, when Canadian forces were clearing German positions west of the Rhine River. The fighting included assaults on fortified German towns and villages where Northovers proved their value once again. Pioneer units that had maintained their Northovers through the winter found renewed demand for the weapons as infantry faced German defensive positions in built-up areas. One particularly effective use occurred during the assault on the town of Gach, where German paratroopers had fortified the medieval town center with strongpoints in stone buildings that had walls thick enough to resist conventional artillery. Canadian forces used coordinated Northover fires from multiple positions, saturating the German strongpoints with high explosive and phosphorus rounds that forced the defenders to evacuate. The town fell with surprisingly light Canadian casualties, and German prisoners specifically mentioned the Northover attacks as having broken their will to continue defending. By April of 1945, as Allied forces advanced deep into Germany itself and German resistance was collapsing across the entire front, Northover employment dropped to nearly zero. The tactical situations that had made the weapon valuable were gone, replaced by rapid advances against disorganized German forces that were more interested in surrendering than in defending positions. Some Canadian units abandoned their Northovers as they advanced, leaving the weapons behind when they no longer served a purpose. Others kept them more from habit than from expectation of future use. When the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, the modified Northover disappeared from active use almost immediately. The weapons were declared obsolete and most were destroyed or scrapped. The improvised explosive rounds, being unstable and dangerous to store, were detonated in controlled demolitions. The manufacturing knowledge remained in the heads of the pioneers who'd built the rounds, but there was no institutional effort to preserve or document the techniques in detail. Post-war, the modified Northover was barely mentioned in official Canadian military histories. The weapon was too improvised, too crude, and too controversial to fit comfortably into narratives about Canadian military professionalism and technological capability. The German accusations of barbarism, while dismissed during the war, created political sensitivity about highlighting weapons that enemy propaganda had characterized as war crimes. The fullest documentation came from veterans' accounts collected decades after the war. Arthur Wilcox, interviewed in 1978, described the technical development of the modified Northover in detail, explaining the engineering challenges and the solutions he'd found. When asked about German claims that the weapon was barbaric, Wilcox responded that he'd been trying to solve a specific tactical problem, how to neutralize fortified positions without losing Canadian soldiers, and the Northover had solved that problem effectively. Whether it was barbaric depended on your perspective, but Wilcox noted that the Germans who complained about Canadian weapons were simultaneously using flamethrowers and incendiary munitions that seemed equally or more cruel. James Chen, the developer of the phosphorus variant, was interviewed in 1983 and expressed more moral ambivalence. Chen acknowledged that phosphorus rounds had probably crossed ethical lines, creating suffering beyond what was militarily necessary. He said that during combat, the only consideration was tactical effectiveness. Did the weapon accomplish the mission? The horrible burns weren't part of the decision-making process. Looking back decades later, Chen said he wished there had been more ethical reflection before phosphorus variants were widely adopted, but he also understood that making those kinds of moral distinctions in the middle of combat was nearly impossible. Military historians examining the modified Northover have generally treated it as a minor footnote in the larger story of Canadian operations in Northwest Europe. The weapon didn't change the strategic situation, didn't win any crucial battles, and didn't represent a significant innovation in military technology. What it did was provide a tactical solution to specific problems faced by Canadian infantry and pioneers, and it did so, using improvised methods that characterized the Canadian approach to warfare throughout the conflict. The question of whether the modified Northover, particularly its phosphorus variant, was barbaric, remains unresolved. International law provided little guidance because the weapon didn't fit neatly into prohibited categories. It wasn't poison gas, wasn't biological warfare, wasn't deliberately targeting civilians. But it was a weapon that caused horrible burns, started fires that sometimes spread beyond military targets, and created suffering that seemed excessive even by the standards of World War II combat. Modern military ethics would likely view phosphorus employment against personnel in enclosed spaces as problematic. Contemporary understanding of proportionality and unnecessary suffering would question whether the tactical advantages justified the specific injuries the weapon produced. But applying modern ethical standards to weapons used in 1944 creates analytical problems because the entire framework of warfare ethics has evolved substantially. What can be said is that the modified Northover represented both Canadian ingenuity and the moral compromises that combat forces. It was effective at solving tactical problems and saving Canadian lives, which made it valuable from a military standpoint. It also caused horrific suffering that went beyond what most people today would consider acceptable, which makes it troubling from an ethical standpoint. Both perspectives are valid, and the tension between them reveals fundamental questions about how we judge weapons and the soldiers who use them. For German soldiers who faced modified Northovers, the experience was uniformly negative. They encountered weapons that attacked from unexpected angles, that created injuries medical staff struggled to treat, and that forced evacuation of positions that should have been defensible. German accounts consistently described Northovers as barbaric, not primarily as propaganda, but as genuine expression of how the weapons felt to those on the receiving end. For Canadian soldiers who built and used Northovers, perspectives varied widely. Some saw effective tools that accomplished missions with minimal friendly casualties. Others were troubled by the suffering the weapons caused, particularly the phosphorus variants. Most fell somewhere in between, accepting the weapons as necessary evils in a brutal war where saving Canadian lives justified methods that might be questionable in peacetime. The modified Northover's legacy is ultimately one of moral complexity. It was simultaneously an innovative solution to tactical problems and a weapon that crossed ethical boundaries. It saved lives on one side while causing horrible suffering on the other. It demonstrated Canadian resourcefulness while also revealing the ease with which combat necessity can override moral restraint. The weapon that Germans called barbaric was barbaric, but it was also effective, and reconciling those two truths remains challenging 80 years after the last round was fired.